So Alan, now you should be able to share your screen.
Yes, I'm just trying to do that. Can you see a copy of my presentation?
Yes,
That's
yes,
great. Okay,
perfect.
thank you.
Thank you.
Uh, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this webinar. This is going to be an updated and abbreviated version of a presentation that I originally gave to NTM, the Swedish Transport and the Environment Organization. I've actually taken the liberty of changing green to low carbon because time is very limited, and I'd like just to look at the decarbonisation and resilience aspects of the subject. Um, there was a paper published by McKinsey back in 2022 when they talked about the devilish duality that CEOs faced in trying to reconcile resilience with net zero promises. A rather provocative statement, almost suggesting these two things were not reconcilable. Um, More recently, there was an article in Forbes magazine which focused more specifically on supply chains, where they say that by making supply chains more sustainable, you actually get a boost to resilience. So that's going to be the theme really of this presentation, looking at the interrelationship between trying to cut carbon emissions from logistics and supply chains and the efforts to improve their resilience. Clearly, both these things are very high up the corporate agenda at the moment. Survey by Gartner 2021 of 1,300 supply chains professionals, mainly in the US and Europe. 87% of them said we're going to invest more in resilience over the coming 2 years. And then on the decarbonisation side, I mean, last time I checked, there are over 8,000 businesses have now signed up to the UN's race to zero. So the two questions I'm going to pose is, first of all, in managing supply chains, are resilience and decarbonisation objectives well aligned? And what are the synergies and the conflicts between these two objectives? Um, so on the one hand, we have got the things we can do to decarbonize logistics and freight transport. There are the five decarbonisation levers, which featured very prominently in Alice's roadmap to zero emission logistics, published in 2019, and which I discuss in some detail in my 2018 book on decarbonising logistics. I'm sure you're familiar with them. It's reducing the demand for freight transport, shifting as much freight as possible to low carbon transport modes, optimizing the use of the logistics assets, improving their energy efficiency, and then finally reducing the carbon content of the energy that we use in logistics. And then on the resilience side, again, there are a whole series of things that we can do to improve the resilience of logistics systems and supply chains. Quite nicely summarized there in an article in 2019 in the Journal of Business Logistics, which looked at the history of research on resilience and supply chain management. And I also discuss it in a report I wrote for the International Transport Forum. I've identified what I would consider to be the seven main things we can do to improve supply chain resilience. Because I've got very limited time, I'm not going to talk about them all. I'm going to focus really on these four. But what I've also done is look at I've mapped the interrelationships, if you like, between the decarbonisation options and the things we can do to improve resilience. There are two things which do not appear on that list, which I regard as simply good supply chain management practice. One is to improve the visibility of upstream supply chains, partly to allow us to measure carbon emissions more effectively across the end-to-end supply chain, but also to make it easier to assess supply chain risk profiles. Um, so on the sustainability side, there's obviously mounting regulatory pressure on businesses to report their upstream supply chain emissions. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that will be introduced soon will be requiring bigger companies to report emissions from their whole value chain. Um, and and then COVID, I think, demonstrated to us how important it is for companies to have a knowledge of the risk associated with upstream sourcing. The Business Continuity Institute, in a survey they did in 2021, found that 40% of COVID-related disruptions were at or above the second tier in company supply chains. But McKinsey has found that only about 2% of businesses have a knowledge of operations above that second tier. I think McKinsey also estimated that about 11 times as much CO2 comes from the upstream supply chain as comes from companies' internal operations. The second good practice here is supply chain collaboration, where companies across the supply chain can have joint initiatives to measure and reduce CO2 emissions as well as mitigating risk. And just examples of that, I mean, there was a legendary CO3 project some years ago, which demonstrated, I think, very effectively that if companies work together and share their logistics assets, they can dramatically reduce the carbon intensity of logistics. And then on the collaboration side, by collaborating, companies can enhance resilience in various ways by sharing risk data and good practice, jointly conducting contingency planning and pooling their assets and their inventory during periods of crisis. And there was a very good example of that here in the UK, although I work at a university in Hamburg. I live in Edinburgh. There were 20 large grocery and household appliance manufacturers during the period of the pandemic that began to work together. They called themselves the COVID-19 Supply Chain Collaboration Group and involved big companies, as you can see, like Unilever and Bosch and so forth. So what I'd like to do now is just to look at the four main resilience options identified and ask to what extent do they enhance resilience and to what extent do they help us to decarbonize. Now, when you talk about supply chain resilience, the first thing that comes to mind is deglobalization. I mean, companies shortening their supply chains in an effort to reduce their vulnerability. And this has spawned a whole vocabulary, words like deglobalization, reshoring, nearshoring, and so forth. What's the impact then of that on supply chain resilience? Much discussed in the business press in recent years. I draw your attention to this article, which I found very interesting. Claims that an awful lot of the discussion of the subject is rather simplistic and rather naive. Many commentators take what I call a one-dimensional view of supply chains. They underestimate the true complexity of global value chains. They underestimate how difficult it's going to be for us to reconfigure those global value chains to reduce risk. And also, shortening supply chains and bringing production and sourcing back to the home market doesn't necessarily reduce risk. I mean, it then concentrates risk in fewer locations. And of course, there are lots of other things you can do to reduce risk in supply chains without necessarily shortening them. And then the impact of deglobalization on carbon emissions. Another paper I'll draw your attention to there by Carbon and Mooti, who say that, again, a lot of the discussion on this subject is rather simplistic, simply equating reshoring with sustainability. Now, there's no question that if we reduce the amount of trade-related transport, we will cut CO2 emissions. But three things. One, minimizing the distance that goods travel does not necessarily minimize their product life cycle emissions. It's estimated by the World Trade Organization that between 50 and 80% of the embodied emissions in internationally traded manufactured goods come from the production rather than the transport. And so, in a PLC basis, it's often more carbon efficient to make things a long way away, so long as those locations are relatively low carbon. And I often draw attention to this much quoted journal paper from 2013 that estimated that about 1/3 of international trade actually helps to cut carbon emissions because that's where the production related emissions in the exporting country are lower than those in the importing country. Moving to my second option, which is relaxing just-in-time pressures. Again, a lot of discussion of this during the pandemic, claiming that companies were now abandoning just-in-time and moving more to a just-in-case approach and building more inventory into their supply chains. But again, there's been an academic backlash against that. I'll draw your attention to this journal paper published recently, which claimed to be debunking misconceptions in the popular press about the role of just-in-time in increasing the vulnerability of supply chains. because I think what people often overlook is that just in time isn't just a way of delivering goods, it's a whole business philosophy. And um, our production systems across so many sectors, delivery system, the amount of storage capacity available has adapted over decades to just-in-time replenishment, and it's going to be very difficult for us, I think, to abandon that, and it will take a lot of time and investment to move to a higher inventory, more agile type of supply chain. But however, that's not to say that what we can do is selectively relax just-in-time pressures in the case of more critical materials and components. And then you ask the question, what are the decarbonisation benefits of relaxing just in time? Um, that relates, I suppose, mainly to the utilization of freight transport assets. Over the years, I've done a lot of research on what is constraining the loading of vehicles. Just in time is one of the causes, but it's only one of many things which result in trucks being less well loaded. Um, but if we were to relax just in time, people argue it would give us more time to consolidate loads and to find backhauls. It would make it easier to shift freight to lower carbon transport modes like rail and water based transport, which on the whole are slower. And it would allow us just to slow down the movement of freight. And I published a journal paper back in 2016 when I simply asked, would freight transport deceleration be an effective way of decarbonising logistics? And when I did that, some of my colleagues thought I had gone mad. They thought this was complete heresy because going faster is hardwired into the process of human development. But anyway, but going back to the more fundamental aspects of just in time, um, what we might do if we relax just in time is reduce carbon emissions from the transport operation, but we could easily increase energy use and CO2 emissions in production and warehousing. And so I've argued for a number of years is what we need is a more holistic assessment of the impact of relaxing just in time on logistics and supply chains. And again, another, I'm highlighting a lot of recent literature which may be of relevance to the two projects that we're featuring in this webinar. A paper looking at the wider carbon impact of just in time. It's essentially a mathematical modeling research project. This one, it doesn't necessarily look at undertake sort of empirical observations, but nevertheless worth looking at. My third resilience option is avoiding overdependence on high risk sources. But sadly, this is exactly what we're going to be doing as we transition to low carbon energy in the freight and logistics sector. Interesting quotation here from a senior director of IHS Market who said, the battery will be the defining technological and supply chain battleground for the automotive industry in the next decade. And why is that? Because it's going to make us very heavily dependent on a very small number of countries. Currently about 80% of EV batteries are made in China. Over half of the cobalt, which we require obviously for batteries, comes from the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's estimated, however, that percentage is going to drop through time as other countries like Australia, Indonesia, Finland develop um, their cobalt mining. But further down the supply chain, 80% of cobalt processing is currently conducted in China. Um, so as we switch from fossil fuel to renewables, what we're going to be doing is concentrating our energy dependence on a few, in many cases, relatively politically risky or unstable countries. But there are fundamental risks, it seems to me, in transitioning freight transport to alternative low carbon energy. It's hard to know at the moment what the future availability and cost of much of that energy will be, particularly things like green hydrogen, for example. Um, and also what will be the rate at which we develop recharging and refueling infrastructure for these low carbon vehicles? And also, what will be the residual value of the new generation of low carbon vehicles, vessels, and rolling stock as well? So, I mean, we have to do this. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't switch to low carbon energy, but we should recognize there are important risks here. And then my fourth and final resilience option is relating to modal shift, making more use of lower carbon transport modes, spreading freight rather than relying solely on road transport, also to make greater use of rail and water. The environmental reasons for doing that are so obvious. I mean, if you compare the average carbon intensity of these different freight transport modes, survey evidence based on a survey, for example, we did in KLU of 90 logistics executives suggests that businesses recognize that modal shift is a very cost effective way of decarbonizing freight transport. But the effectiveness of modal shift as a risk mitigation measure depends, it seems to me, fundamentally on two things. One is the ability of the shipper to coordinate multiple transport modes. I mean, in practice, applying the principles of synchromodality, for example. But the second thing is what is the relative vulnerability of these different freight transport modes. And we saw in 2022, for example, in Europe, where we had very hot weather, and again, indeed in 2023, that we had disruption of rail services because it was so hot it buckled the railway lines. And we also had drought, which reduced water levels in some of the waterways. So, although that's maybe a bit negative, there was a paper published in 2020 which looked at the carbon impact of future climate change on European inland waterway networks, and it was actually quite positive in suggesting that climate change might actually benefit the inland waterway sector. So, just to end with a few conclusions, clearly both supply chain and resilience and decarbonizations are very high on companies' uh, agendas and mindsets. It seems overall that there is a reasonable but not a perfect alignment of resilience and decarbonisation objectives. Um, both of these things will unquestionably benefit from improving supply chain visibility and improving the level of collaboration across the supply chain. And of course, if we take a broader perspective on this, our efforts to decarbonize the global economy will slow the rate of climate change and therefore will fundamentally reduce the future climate risk to supply chains. Um, it seems to me, too, that the relationship between two of probably the most debated resilience options, namely deglobalization and relaxing just in time, that they are, though much of that discussion is a bit naive and oversimplistic, and there's a need for a greater recognition of the complexities involved. Um, I think when we look at this relationship between resilience and decarbonisation, we should do so in both directions. And then my final point is it seems to me that geopolitics is likely to be exerting an increasing influence both on supply chain resilience and decarbonisation, and is clearly becoming an increasing source of risk to the way that we manage our freight transport and logistics. I'm sorry that has been very rapid. I hope you found it of interest. There are some of the reports that I mentioned, and yeah, so and good luck with the two EU-funded research projects in this area, which are now beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, for your presentation.